I wanted the first session to sort of be an orientation point for you, at least in terms of understanding me, where I'm coming from, explaining that to you, and also that you will begin to see the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about these 3 days, what I'm hoping to hit on. And part of the logic here is, since I know that some of what I say will be quite new, like, I never heard that before, my pastor never told me this before, yeah, you're going to get a lot of that. I want to have a place where I can say, you might feel alarmed, but don't freak out, don't panic. What I'm going to tell you, I have not only good reasons to tell you, but it's going to reflect very mainstream in terms of scholars within biblical studies, very mainstream stuff. There's nothing I'm going to really say that if I was giving this to a bunch of scholars, they'd all be asleep in about 5 minutes, because this is stuff everybody goes over and has to deal with and whatnot. So I want you to know that it's based on sound scholarship, but to really understand why people understand and I understand the text the way I do, you need to sort of get it in your head as to why Mike is approaching things the way he is. And so that's the purpose of the first one. Now, we talk about the need to interpret the Bible in its own context. Well, that's wonderful. It's necessary. Everybody feels compelled to go that direction. But the dirty little secret is that the Bible's context is not yours, and it's not mine in terms of where we live. The time we live, our own spiritual context. The context of the Bible isn't ours or anyone else born after the 1st century. That means several things. Biblical context is not the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, to interpret the Bible correctly, you are not interpreting it in its own context if you are filtering it through the Roman Catholic Church. You're not interpreting the Bible in context if you're filtering it through the Reformation. Now, I know Calvin was really smart. We probably don't have any John Calvins today. I know Martin Luther was a great guy, but they are not the Bible's own context. It's not the Puritans either, and it's not our own 20th or 21st century evangelicalism. What I'm trying to get across here is that we all think we're interpreting the Bible in context when we agree with it. Okay, when we agree with the interpretation that comes out the other end. I'm going to be saying some things and showing you some things that are going to be quite foreign to these items here, these contexts. What biblical context is the historical, religious, literary, and pre-scientific context in which it was written. The way people thought when it was produced. God used people to produce the Scripture, people who lived at a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain context. And when you can get your head into that, then you're interpreting the Bible according to context. So it might be strange, might be incongruent, there's going to be some things that might even feel offensive, but if you are committed, and we all say we are, if you are committed to interpreting the Bible in context, that is what you need to do. Your context is not the Bible's context. The Bible's context is the one that produced it. Okay, that time frame. So I would like to put it this way. I think we need to honor God's decisions. It was God's choice to decide, I'm going to step into human history at this point. I'm going to use people to produce something for the people of God, for my people, that's going to be for posterity, that's going to, be from here till, eternity as far as what I want people to know about myself and about what my plan is. I'm going to do it at this time with a specific culture. I'm going to use people of a culture, but that doesn't mean I endorse what they're doing necessarily. In fact, I would say God largely ignores certain things, because in God's mind, he wants to pick a person living in the second millennium BC. He has a specific task for them in terms of what they're writing. And what they think about, how they treat their goats and their sheep, or even their wives, is incidental. That isn't what God's worried about. God's worried about, I'm going to take this man, he's faithful, he believes in me, and I'm going to influence him so that he writes things down that I want recorded for the rest of his people and the rest of the believers that follow him. God doesn't bother to alter the culture. It is what it is. God's using people, they're the best he has to work with. I mean, if you're going to say that there's this thing called inspiration, that God uses people to produce revelation, to transmit it, to get it down on paper, as it were. If you're going to say that, and that's what the Judeo-Christian tradition says, then you have to put up with, you have to honor God's decision as to when to do that, and the fact that God doesn't bother to step in and say, well, okay, Moses, I'd love to use you to write this stuff down, but first you need to go back home and you need to change this way about what you live, you need to change this custom that your people keep. He doesn't do any of that. He just takes them for what they are. They're just people. And God uses people. Okay? He's not bothering to change them into superhuman people or change their culture into something else. He doesn't circumvent it either by giving writers advanced knowledge. Now, I'm going to say, we're not going to spend too much time on cosmology. We will a little bit. But sometimes I'll go into a certain context, and this will upset people, because when it comes to creation, and I believe God created our world, everything we see and know, and matter and all that kind of stuff. But the Bible is not a scientific book. They didn't know anything about genetics. They didn't know anything about physics. They think that the seat of your emotions are your kidneys or your bowels, okay? They don't know anything about blood circulation. They don't know anything about most of this stuff. Now, God could have given them 21st century and beyond knowledge, and then they could have encoded that or written it out. But the problem is, if God's giving that to one person supernaturally, allowing them to say things and use words and use descriptions that we would look at and say, wow, that looks like 21st century. That looks like what we know now. As soon as he writes that down and hands it to somebody else, they're going to look at it and go, I don't know what you're talking about. I got no idea what you're talking about. What in the world are you thinking? Biblical Hebrew doesn't have a word for brain, because they didn't know that this thing up here was the seat of emotions and intellect and volition and all that kind of stuff. They thought it was here or down here. It doesn't even have a word for brain. You got no idea. So if Moses or some other biblical writer would have coined a term that he would have told people, it refers to this gray stuff in your head, they would have, okay, all right, I know there's something in there, but what do you mean that my feelings come from up? They don't come from up here. They come from in other words, there would have been a disconnect. So God doesn't bother changing their mindset, changing their worldview, changing their culture, changing the way they look at things to communicate truth. We often impose that on Scripture because that is what we know. Okay? So the question becomes, are you taking the biblical statements at face value the way they thought about them, or are you taking them the way you think about them? Two entirely different things. And there are going to be things that we encounter along the way that I'm going to try to show you the way an Israelite would have thought about a particular statement or topic. because my thing is I'm committed to trying to help you, and always be at work at this myself, to think like an ancient Israelite, to decipher the text the way they would have understood it when God approached them and moved people to write it down. Because if we don't do that, if we're inserting our own world into this, we're going to miss some things. It's not like we're going to be hopelessly wrong, but we're going to miss some things that are important. Our concerns are not central to God's decision. Now, God knew we would be sitting here in this room, here in the 21st century, but when he spoke to Moses or Jeremiah or Isaiah, his concern was not, man, we got to pick words here that they're going to understand in Lehighton, in October. That is not the issue. The issue is communication through a writer at a specific time to a people at a specific time, with the understanding that God's Spirit would be able to help people in succeeding generations understand, and also that the people of God would transmit the text and the knowledge that goes with it. So he's not doing an inspiration for us necessarily in our worldview. So we need to make decisions. I would say you need to decide to allow the Bible to be what it is and resist thinking the reverse. Okay? Trying not to make it what you want it to be, or trying not to mold it to your own modern system of theology. If I were a Presbyterian, I would be trying to resist framing the biblical content in such a way that John Calvin would go. Okay? Calvin was a great man. He was a great scholar and a great believer. But believe it or not, Calvin was not, in many cases, thinking like an ancient Israelite, because he didn't know. We have material today that, had Calvin had it, he would have been alerted to a lot of things. And when I say that, I'm talking about things like ancient texts that use the same vocabulary as Hebrew, that are parallels, Dead Sea Scrolls, stuff like Calvin didn't have any of that. Those languages weren't even deciphered until the 19th century, 300 years after Calvin lived and died. So we do have the benefit of that. So we need to, again, try to take that and think like they did in the original context, not something else. I would also say you need to make a decision to be more loyal to the text than your own denomination. You will pay a price for this. Trust me, I know. But I think it's worth it. I think had the goal been a specific denomination, the entire activity of producing the scripture would have looked quite different than what it did, or what it is, what it looks like as we look back. So it's the text or something else. Trust God that he knew what he was doing it this way. Because when he speaks to an ancient person and he wants to communicate the idea of evil and disorder, that there's a certain reason why natural disasters happen, that there's something woven into creation that makes it unpredictable. An ancient person understood that and believed that, and God will use certain images, certain words to communicate this idea that are lost on us. But it really matters because, we have these questions. When Hurricane Katrina sweeps through New Orleans, did God decree that? Okay, did God make that happen? Did he need it to happen for some bigger plan? Or is there some other reason? If you pose that question to an ancient Israelite, what would they say? Well, chances are they'd say something a little bit different than what a lot of theologians say now. And that's because God communicated a certain idea to them in their culture. So we have to trust God that it was a good decision to produce the scripture, in the second millennium BC as opposed to today or the 16th century or whatever. I would say you also need to draw your theology from the text. and not filter it through, again, whatever beliefs you have. The goal is to understand the text on its own terms. You also need to live with your own lack of omniscience. It's okay to say, I don't know. I say that because I don't. I will tell you what I think, and I will even scale things for you. Okay, here's Mike's probability. You know, what I think is probably the best option for interpretation here. Here's 3, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm not at, here's why. But, you know, you have to live with the fact that you not only just can't know everything, but you can't completely get your head put back in the 2nd millennium BC. There's just no way to completely do that. But you can try, and there are good, good ways to try to do that. You do the best you can, but at the end of the day, you have to be comfortable with the fact that, I could be wrong, I could be missing something here. And that leads to what I call theological honesty, otherwise known as humility. I think in our own effort to try to go back and really think about biblical theology, think like an ancient Israelite would. Again, realizing that we don't know everything, we shouldn't also try to avoid coming across like we do know everything and then criticize, lots of other things. We just need to be honest. But I think our loyalty, our paramount loyalty, needs to be to the text instead of a tradition, instead of any of our traditions. I would say this. My advice is interpret the Bible like an ordinary book. It's not a divine book, it's a divine human book. Okay, you catch the little phrase there. I'm not eliminating the divine nature of Scripture, but sometimes I think we forget that there were people involved. The Bible was not produced by a paranormal event. Now, one of my biggest gripes with the way we understand inspiration is that we have this assumption that, Moses or Isaiah gets up in the morning and just goes into a trance or something, and then wakes up and looks down and says, wow, that's kind of cool. Did I write that? Like something takes over their mind and their hand just starts moving, okay? It's not the way it happened, and you can tell if you pay attention to the text, it's not the way it happened, because there's editorial things happening in the text. There are very human things happening in the text. There are very cultural things happening in the text. God used people. People are people. At the end of the day, what they produced, God was happy with. You got it right. He looked down and said, good job. That'll do. Nice work there. Because God has been watching this person since they were born, molding their life, preparing them for this moment. They are what they are because of a whole concatenation of a series of events. They are ready to do the thing God intended for them to do. And God just has to give them a little push, give them a little compulsion, a little influence. You need to sit down and write this letter to the Galatians now. The time is now. You're ready, they're ready, they need it. Start writing. And God lets Paul or whoever, lets them write that letter. But again, God is supervising the work. Theoretically, this is just theory. If they goofed, God will say, okay, I'll fix that. Go to bed now, take a nap, wake up, come back to that, go to your amanuensis or yourself, and I'd like to say it this way. There's just a providential oversight process that's different than a paranormal event. Paul, I wrote this letter, I'm going to sleep on it now. Or I'm going to go have lunch, and I'll come back, and there's this one section I think I could do a little bit better. I'm going to use this as an illustration instead of that. There's a process to it. But at the end of the day, when Paul says, I think I'm done now, God will look at it and say, good job. That is what I wanted you to produce. But it's a very human thing. It's a divine and human book and process. So again, we have ordinary people. God is involved at every step of the process because it's His story. He knows how he wants it told. It's told by people he chose using human techniques. Why is it that one gospel, now you can notice this in English, in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all write about the life of Christ, but they aren't identical. Some include things that others don't. Even when they write about the same thing, the words can be different. And even when you get down like to the Greek text, they'll use different tenses. Okay, they'll put it in a different sentence. Communicates the same thought, but it's different. Okay, if God's dictating everything or doing the automatic writing trance thing, there's no explanation for that. But a writer, because Mark or Matthew or Luke had a very specific intention up here, again, God prepared them for. God influenced them that would be in their mind at that day, at that time, during that trip, when they're producing this. Because they have something specific up here, they want to craft what they're doing in a deliberate way. They have intent behind it. So we're going to get on, not today, but tomorrow, there are some really unusual things happening in something as basic as Jesus' genealogy. Why is it that there are certain women in Jesus' genealogy? Okay, why those 4 and not 4 others? The writer has a very deliberate reason for picking the 4 that he does. That's a human thing, because he wants to communicate a certain idea, but it's also a God thing. Again, God preparing him providentially through the course of his life, leading him to a situation where he sits down and says, I know I need to put the story of the Lord in writing. What are some things I think are important to communicate, to telegraph? Well, that question is going to be largely answered by that person's experiences, what they perceive the need to be. And so when Matthew sits down to write, puts out his genealogy, he has something he wants to communicate very subtly by choosing those 4 women. His deliberate reasons for it. It's going to surprise you because it does relate, again, to what we call divine counsel stuff. It's just something that you'd miss unless you were looking for it. So what I tell people about, looking at the Bible like an ordinary book. Again, this is going to sound odd, it might even sound controversial, it might even sound disturbing. I think that Christians it would be really beneficial if you would read the Bible like it's fiction. Read it like a novel. You know, when you read a novel, you know it's a story. So that when you're reading a particular scene, you just sort of know, because you've read a lot of fiction, and you kind of know what to expect. You know that the guy who wrote this, or the woman who wrote this, is going to do things to me, as a reader, to get my mind to track a certain way. So you know that guy that was in that scene, I'll bet I'm going to see him again. That place where this event happened, I'll bet I'm going to see that again. That word, that line, I'll bet I'm going to see that again. That is there for a reason. There's an intelligent mind behind the way this is put together. And you're alert, because that's what novels do. It's not what textbooks do. Textbooks are dry, and it's just dispensing information, and it's just topical, and once we're done with that, we're never going to see it. It's a different thing, but when you read a novel, you just know that it's a story, and I need to be sensitized, I need to be alert to the author doing things to me, getting me to think a certain way, storing things in my mind to be ready for when they spring them again. If you read the Bible like that, you'd get a lot more out of it, because you would be looking for patterns. Patterns are more important than most other things you do in Bible study. Word studies, even writing notes, it's good to write things down because then you preserve them. But what I'm saying is, if you read it like it was fiction, you sort of have this inner hearing that's just, it's turned on now. I'm ready to be not manipulated, but I'm ready to have somebody tell me certain things with intent. I'm alert to be looking for that. And we're going to see a few of those, more than a few. So ramifications. Ordinary people do not always intend to be understood literally. The biblical writers are people. Okay, if you remember anything from this session, remember the Bible's context is not my own, and these ramifications. God uses people, and people, when they write, do not always intend to be understood one way. When you use words with a spouse, you write a letter, you write an email, you assume that the person on the other end of that will know when you're using words literally, and they'll know when you're not. You make that assumption. Because the other person on the other end knows that people don't always use words the same way for the same reasons. The biblical writers are no different. Sometimes when they use a word, they mean the real-time, literal, one-to-one real correspondence thing. Other times they use words to make you think more abstractly. Same word. We're going to see some of that, and that will influence how we think about prophecy. Okay? I'll leave it there for now. Ordinary people who write stories do deliberate things in crafting the story. There's intent. Their thoughts are selective. They plant ideas. They structure information in a certain way. Vocabulary, again, is not one-dimensional. Think about it. If I use the word run, what does the word run mean? Anybody?
Move quickly by...
Move quickly. Why did you assume I meant a verb?
It's something you get in a card game.
Could be a horizontal dimension.
Could be what they score in baseball. Okay? It could be something a woman gets in her pantyhose. I mean, you look at the word run in a dictionary, you're going to have about 20, 25 different meanings. A clever writer will use the word run so that you really have to think about it. Which one did they mean? Maybe they mean all of them at the same time. Maybe they're trying to be clever. Maybe it's a play on words. Maybe I'm supposed to think abstractly so that I can think literally. You just, when you're a sensitive reader, you know, especially if it's fiction or poetry or something like that, you know you can't assume the first thing that pops into your head, the first literal thing that pops into your head. Bible is no different. They're real people using real words that have wide ranges of meaning and can even overlap. This is why patterns are important. Because if you can, let's say the writer uses the word 10 times, and like 8 of those times, yeah, you know, okay, it's not literal, it's an abstract thing. So these other 2 over here, maybe they're maybe, you know, he's got a run here, all 10 are like that. But maybe he wants to break the pattern so that I notice it. Writers do things like that just to draw your attention. You can't assume it's always the same way. But when we go to prophecy, I'm just, you know, I'm sure this is not news to anybody. There is this reflex, especially within the evangelical community, that everything has to be literal. Everything has to be one-to-one, you know, correspondence. What the person thought of in the Old Testament using this word, I have to draw a complete one-to-one equation over here the way the New Testament writer uses it. So what they were thinking here must be what they're thinking there. Why? Who made that rule up? You're going to find that the New Testament writers are very flexible. they're going to pull stuff out of their hat over here that you never saw coming over there. Why? Because you were thinking one way over here. And you're thinking that one way has to be this way. And the New Testament writer's like, boy, did you miss it. Maybe I just did a bad job. Or maybe the problem is you, read it like it's a piece of writing. We tend to read the Bible like it's a paranormal thing, like an object. Like it's something that I better not think about it because it's from God. God doesn't want me to think about it too much. No, he wants you to think about it a lot. He wants you to recognize it for what it is. He used people to produce things for you to digest. And since they're people, they do people things when they write, just like anybody else. Literalism at times is just inadequate for Bible interpretation. We're going to see a few examples of that. And I'm not going to just tell you that that's what I think. I'm going to show you that a New Testament writer quotes an Old Testament passage, and you're going to wonder, what in the world was that guy on? Because the way he's using this passage over here, I would have never guessed that. It looks like he's wrong. It's just so unexpected that it looks like he messed it up. No, he didn't mess it up. It looks that way because of your expectation. He's doing something deliberate. You're just missing it. Symbolic meaning does not mean not real. For those of you out there in TV land listening, you have got to get over this. You've got to get over the idea that if, when Heiser says some meaning could be symbolic, he just means it's not really real. No. If you believe in a spiritual world, a world that transcends your own experiences, your own terrestrial reality, if you believe in that, how can you say that something that transcends literalness isn't real? You have a theological problem on your hands. Okay, so symbolic, abstract. Instead of symbolic, think of abstract, an abstract meaning. Doesn't mean that it's not real. In many cases, it transcends your expected reality, your own experiential reality. It's bigger. It's more real than what you're expecting. Again, we need to hold on to those thoughts about bigness and transcending our own reality. Biblical symbology draws on its own context again. When the biblical writer references a dragon, okay, there are places where, Revelation 12, where the writer says dragon and references it to the serpent. Okay, then that's nice, because then he's telling you, here's a connection I'm thinking of. I'm putting it down for you. But the dragon, as a symbol, has a long history in the Old Testament. There were certain associations, certain ideas that accrued to that image that are not apparent to us, but that were very apparent to the first century person reading it. Those connections are just as real as the one you got, the one he telegraphed. Sometimes the writer will think, man, people know this so well, I don't need to go into all the details, they just know it. Well, that was good for them, because they did know it. Not really good for us, because we're 2,000 years later. And the only way we're going to know it is to get inside their heads, so that we can appreciate all the baggage, all the things attached to that image. We're going to be looking at imagery a lot over the next 2 days. Biblical symbology is self-referential. What I mean by this is that when you're looking for abstract meanings to a symbol, those meanings, that range of possibilities needs to come and will come from the biblical text itself. You don't need to go out into some, weird land of, interpretation or something like that. You want to look somewhere else within the Bible for how these images are used. And oftentimes, a writer will deliberately use one word or a phrase so that your mind immediately goes to a specific passage. Even though they don't quote it, there will be something that they pick that your mind, again, they're assuming you know the text really well. They're assuming that when you read that, your mind will immediately go right there. It's just like the novelist. Okay, the novelist gave you a phrase or a scene in the first chapter, that just was riveting. And again, you had this sense that I'm going to see this again, and I know I'm going to see it again somewhere. 300 pages later, if he's done his job, or she's done her job well, as soon as they put that in, your mind will go back to that page. It's like a trigger. There it is. Boom. I was waiting for it, and now I see it. Biblical writers do the same thing. So they don't even have to quote passages. They don't have to say, thus says the Lord, or as it is written. I mean, that tells you that they're going to quote something. A lot of times they don't do that. They're just writing along, and I want them to think this thought. They'll get it. They'll get it if I put this in. And they did. Again, it's harder for us because we're further removed. But they do that. Self-contained, again, that again is a reference to let the biblical writer's own patterns give you the frame of reference for the literal possibilities and the abstract possibilities. Again, try to keep it within the writer's own context, what he's doing in his own culture, and even within the book itself. You're not going to have to run all over the place, because the biblical writers will either use things that are so familiar to the wider culture that nobody would even ask, or they will, I don't want to get too far ahead, but Leviathan. Leviathan was known outside the biblical world. If you were an Israelite and you walked, to some Canaanite town and said, "Hey, how about that Leviathan?" Okay, they're going to know, other than thinking, "Man, I got to get away from this guy." They're going to be thinking certain thoughts, because across the board, no matter if they're a Canaanite, if they're a Mesopotamian, if they're a Babylonian, they're going to know there's a certain set of ideas that goes with that term. Okay, so there are those kinds of things, but there are even tighter things, again, where if a biblical writer uses the word servant post-Isaiah, you can't help but think, okay, am I supposed to be thinking of the servant in Isaiah? Because that word occurs a lot in that book. Again, it's self-referential, it's contained. And a biblical writer will use certain things because they want your mind drawn into certain places. They want you to think a certain, flow of thought. And they can do that really, really easily. Other considerations. Understanding myth, in quotation marks, and the Bible's relation to it and beyond it. Now, myth is a term that, I'm calling this book The Myth That Is True, this book I'm working on. And I'm using it like I'm going to describe it here. Myth is a term used for any piece of writing, ancient or modern, that has characters that are divine. That's all the word means. So when you have some scholar or some guy on NPR, talking about, the mythical narrative of the Bible, he probably means two things. One is this, that in literary terms, it's a myth because there's divine characters. Now, the second thing is he probably just doesn't believe it. Okay, so then he would call it, but that would be a fairy tale to him. But myth, as people use it, academics use it, means God's a character, angels are characters, demons are characters. It's a genre term. I'm bringing it up because I might use the term at some point during the next 2 days. And I want you to know what I mean by it and what I mean by the title of the book. So in that sense, a lot of the Bible is myth because God's the character. He's a central figure. It's not that God isn't real, it's just that's what it is literarily. We believe that the Bible is the myth that is true. Okay? It is a certain style of literature, but it also happens to be true. And I like Tolkien's thing, the guy who wrote The Lord of the Rings, he referred to the Bible as true myth. This is where a lot of this kind of thing comes from. And I like the quotation here. Myth is a means of communicating truth that could not be conveyed in any other way. All myths and religions contain some aspects, some distortions, some distorted reflection of the true myth, which is the gospel as revealed in the Bible. Why would Tolkien call, or the source of the quotation, call the gospel the true myth? Because Jesus was a character, and Jesus was God in the flesh, and so that's what it is in terms of genre, but it's the one that turns out to be real. Okay? Myth has entered into reality and history only in Christianity. So far from being fantasy or fiction created by fertile human imaginations, myth was for Tolkien a way of knowing truth. And I'm going to, when we talk about symbols and images, I'm going to draw attention to the fact that biblical writers will use pieces of mythology, myth, from other literatures around them because they want to take that because people know it, they're familiar with it. Everybody knows this particular story about Baal or this one about Tiamat or something like that. Everybody knows this. I'm going to use this as a vehicle and I'm going to do something with it. Usually they'll take the bad deity out and put the good deity in, Yahweh, the God of Israel, so that Yahweh gets credit for creation or for bringing rain or something like that. They're going to take a piece of myth, transform it into a myth that's true. It's a theological corrective. Biblical writers do this a lot, probably more so in the Old Testament than the New. The New Testament writers will use things that later, in late antiquity, Renaissance, medieval era, they will use things like gematria. Gematria, you all know what gematria is? It's giving a number that has a symbolic or hidden meaning, an occult meaning. Occult just means hidden. The Bible does that. Now, it's a sinister term for us because of what's done with it after the New Testament era. 666 is the classic example. John tells you the secret isn't the number because he gives you the number. The secret is this number has a meaning. It is the number of a man, or a human number, you could translate it. So the number itself conveys an idea. That's gematria. The 153 fish, it's gematria. It comes from somewhere. It's not just John saying, well, I got this story about Jesus and, frying a fish on the beach and, like how many fish did I say he did? Or how many fish should I say that they caught? And 153 sounds good. It's not random. That comes from somewhere. And people knew where it came from. It brought along a certain set of ideas. And John uses it deliberately. Abraham went out to fight with the 5 kings. And he took 318 men with him. How many men should we say he had? 300? Let's make it a little 318. It's not random. The number means something. Okay. Biblical writers will use techniques of myth, okay, these stories that people know, and techniques that the biblical world would have associated with something unfavorable, like the Baal cycle or something like that. But they'll bring it in because they want to use it for a specific purpose, to communicate a corrective idea, a theologically corrective idea. They'll do that. And so Tolkien is alluding to this sort of thing, literary form, all that kind of stuff. In the gospel, truth has entered into history and reality, and the Christian myth was the singular truth to which all other stories pointed. And all other stories were somehow related to it, but inferior to it in terms of truth. This is why, incidentally, that the church fathers thought that a lot of the ancient gods and myths were allowed to develop as they did by God, because they still had vestiges of the truth in them that God would later use to win them to Christ. That God would influence people to take certain ideas out and use them as bridges for evangelism. Again, biblical writers are claiming their story of divine activity is the one that's true. They do this to teach truth to the masses. They utilize things that the wider culture would have been familiar with, even pagans. And that interaction, and hence its power, is lost on us largely, again, because we don't know their context. Okay, if I was sitting here and we were in the 1st century and I got a bunch of Jews and Greeks, and I said, hey, let's talk about the 153 fish. Yeah, let's talk about that. That means Jesus is superior to there's a whole set of ideas that comes with it that are totally lost on us. Because they were trying to communicate. The Bible communicates its ideas, again, using mythic words, symbols, catchphrases, familiar to them. This means it's deeply flawed to assume that its mythic words, symbols, and catchphrases point to modern times, knowledge, or events. Now catch that sentence. If the biblical writer is using ancient ideas, ancient fragments of their stories, their myths, if it's written in an ancient cultural context, it can't possibly be pointing to black helicopters. It just can't. Okay? If that was God's intention, if that was really God's intention, no one in the 1st century, no one prior to the invention of a black helicopter would have known what the heck was going on. Wouldn't have had a prayer. Now you say, well, John's having a vision, and he could be looking into the 21st century, he could be looking at Apache helicopters and stuff like that. You only think that because you're living now. You're not thinking that because it's exegetical, because there's something in the text that tells you to think that way. You're thinking that because you live now. And what I'm going to try to get you to consider is, don't think now, think then. Okay, it has its own context. John uses certain descriptions because the people he's writing to, and they all expected the Lord to come back in their lifetime. I mean, if there's anything true about prophecy, that's pretty obvious now, because it's just smattered everywhere in the New Testament, this expectation. They're using descriptions and imagery and symbols that the people of that time will understand and get a message, okay, a certain message. If the intent was 21st century, then essentially every believer prior to that time was hoodwinked. It was a false expectation. It was a false hope. Not in a sinister way, but God looking down on them and saying, oh well, I wish I could have said something that you would have understood or would have really meant something to you genuinely, but When you get to heaven, you won't even worry about it, so who cares? It's their context. Okay, that's what I want to try to get across. Keep it in their context. So will I let the Bible be what it is? It's not easy. It's easy for us to say it, but it's not easy to do. Or am I going to retool it in my own image? Am I going to filter it through my own tradition, in my own time, in my own circumstances? We need to interpret the Bible with the big picture in mind. I've got a few slides left here. My suggestion is, and you're going to just see us, you're going to see me do this. I'm not going to do it didactically, but you're going to see me do things like this. Don't ignore the templates. Don't ignore the patterns. Don't ignore the way the New Testament writer uses the Old. That'll tell you something. Don't ignore the fact that the biblical writers are writing it like it's a novel. They're trying to get you to think certain thoughts. Don't ignore the fact that they structure information in a certain way that they would have understood, maybe not you. What good are the puzzle pieces if you don't have the lid for the help? Well, we're going to be covering over the next couple days some major thematic ideas. They are here across the top: kingdom, kingship, the subjects of the kingdom, the people in the kingdom, and conflict. If I can reduce biblical theology to 4 sort of umbrella areas, this is how I would do it. Again, place, person, residence, and enemies. These are the big ideas of the story, and the writers will use all sorts of different methods to talk about the kingdom, to talk about what kingship is, to talk about who's in the kingdom, and to talk about the struggle, the conflict with evil. They're going to use all sorts of vehicles to do that. Each one of these is going to be situated in the past. The biblical writers will talk about things that were before them, their time. They'll talk about things that are happening in their own time, and they'll talk about things in the future. They will talk about all 4 of these subjects in past, present, and future, and they're all connected. Biblical writers will consistently want to create threads. Here's something that happened way back in Adam and Eve, or way back in Noah, and there's that little thread that starts there, and then all of a sudden, at some other time, they'll say something to get you to think back to that. And then once they say this here, a few hundred years later, somebody else will say something else. Okay, I need to pick up that thought and that thought to understand this one. Okay? They will thread ideas through all of these subjects. And I'm going to try to give you a really brief overview. I know it's 2-3 days. It's still going to be a brief overview of tracing certain threads through both testaments. And specifically, our aim this time is to connect it to how we look at prophecy. So, kingdom. Again, this is a quick summary of the kinds of things that I'm going to be showing you. Kingdom in the past refers to places like Eden. It's where God lives. It's where He rules. You do realize that Eden was not the whole earth. Eden has geography in Genesis. It's a little piece of earth. It's not the whole globe. It's a little piece, little piece of turf. Sinai, Zion. There's an unseen realm that God is, that is the kingdom as well. The present, again, depending on which biblical writer we look at, they're going to be talking about the kingdom of God in their own time in a certain way, building on what's gone before, and then accumulating that thread, that set of ideas. They will use that to project into the future. They won't be doing projections into the future randomly. Hey, I'm going to make up a new idea now that's completely detached from everything else that went before. They don't do that. They will attach what they say about the future to the past. They will attach what they say in Revelation to something in Exodus, to something in Isaiah, to something in Daniel, to something in Zechariah. It's a continuous stream of threads. And if you disconnect Revelation from these threads over here, you're not going to be anywhere close. And when I talk about the threads over here, I'm talking about literal points of understanding and abstract points of understanding. They will connect literal things to revelation, they'll connect symbols to revelation. They're trying to create threads, they're trying to create continuity of ideas. Kingship. Well, God is the king, there's the Davidic king. Again, there's this, heaven and earth, seen and unseen realms thing going on. In Old Testament, again, God, Davidic king, is the earth unruled? When there's not a Davidic king, is that ever true? Are the future kings going to be the same as the past kings? Will it look the same way? Will it be literal or abstract? Will it be both? Because it was both in the past, maybe it's both in the future. Why does it have to be one and not the other? Again, this is really quick now, and it's going to feel disconnected. But we'll go through all these things. Kingship and subjects. If you look at the future part here, will kingship, again, look the same way in what we think of as the future kingdom? Will it look the same way as it did in the past? Or will it be, different in terms of, is it literal or abstract, or is it both? Which version of the kingdom in the Old Testament will the future kingdom look like? Because there was a time when God was king and you had a kingdom on earth before Israel. It was called Eden. It was called Sinai. Okay, it was called, the whole Deuteronomy 32 worldview thing. God is king of the nations and picks one. He's using this language before you even have a land. Okay, so is it possible that kingdom in the future is disconnected from a specific land? You know what I'm getting at here. We have this idea of defining kingship only in terms of Israel. This millennial kingdom idea. Okay, because that's an obvious connection to draw, because it comes from the Old Testament idea. But there is kingdom thinking, kingdom language, kingdom happening, kingdom reality that's disconnected from Israel. It's more than that in the Old Testament. So is the future kingdom, which one is it going to look like, or maybe all of them? Who knows? Because the writer of Revelation is trying to connect you back, trying to get you to look back. Again, the subjects, human and divine. If, let's just say, and I'm not taking a position here, because I don't believe this, but let's just say that the kingdom of God in the future is only in the unseen spiritual realm. Some people would say, oh man, that's disappointing. I want there to be a literal 1,000 year. Well, okay, I understand that. But is that any less real? See, it feels less real to us because we're terrestrial. We're embodied. But if you really believe in an unseen world that's just as real as ours, that's real. It's still real, and you're going to be a part of it. Maybe not the way you think of, but you'll be a part of it. The real question in eschatology, is that all there is? Or is there something going on right here? Conflict. The fourth theme, chaos. There is a chaos concept we're going to talk about this morning. You have problems of the state of the earth, being what it is, being imperfect. You have intelligent evil, going on. You have unseen forces and seen forces, unbelievers, believers, so on and so forth. All these things, again, they're the same way. There are past references, current references to the biblical writer, and future references, and they're all threads. They all need to be understood in continuity. We're going to talk about literal geography and cosmic geography. They are connected, but they are different. Sometimes we need to give up literal geography to understand cosmic geography, to understand what a passage is really getting at. Again, application to eschatology, here's going to be my method, my unconscious and conscious method, both of them. Here's how my mind works, essentially. The wider ancient Near Eastern culture informs the Old Testament, because that's when they lived. They're going to use symbols, words, stuff like that in the Old Testament itself to articulate ideas. That in turn informs what comes after it, both in terms of what goes on between the Testaments, books like Enoch and other things. Jewish people are writing and thinking and doing theology, trying to understand, just like we do, and all that becomes part of what's floating around in their head. So the Old informs the intertestamental period, the New Testament, and all of that informs the New Testament itself in terms of its projections of the future. Everything builds on what comes previously. You don't just do the last one by itself. You don't do the last one in light of the 21st century. You do the last one in light of everything that's come before to understand it. So let's take a break, and we'll come back and jump into it. 10 minutes.